So much, Rabia.
Yeah, that's all done.
Fab, and I think we'll have a little red dot somewhere that will tell us that it's recorded.
Yeah, it should say on the left-hand side of your screen. Yeah.
Brill, thanks Rabia. So again, welcome to our event. Today is the first of 2 events that we're hosting for Islamophobia Awareness Month. For those of you who don't know, my name is Zinat. I am a barrister and the founder of the Redefined project. For those of you who have not joined us on any of these sessions before, Redefined is an alternative learning and awareness platform for lawyers from minoritized backgrounds who are committed to social justice, advocacy, and activism. Although our audience is primarily lawyers and aspiring lawyers, our events are open to all with interest in our work. We create space for critical conversations which are not happening in mainstream legal platforms that we believe require spotlighting. As such, we're really pleased to bring you today's event, Islam versus the State, Legitimizing Islamophobia. Where do state-led Islamophobic frameworks lie? I'm joined by a fantastic panel of speakers who bring together a multidisciplinary approach by way of legal practice, academia, policy, advocacy, and activism. The discussion will reflect on the relationship between the freedom of religion, the freedom of speech, highlighting case studies of ongoing legitimations of state-led Islamophobic frameworks. Today's event has an international focus, whilst our second event on the 4th, which we'll tell you more about later on, will have more of a UK focus. We are grateful to you all for joining us and supporting the fundraising campaign for the Uyghur Tribunal in memory of Akil Nurali, a junior barrister who sadly very recently passed away and who was committed to this cause. Thank you for supporting this important work and also honouring Akil's legacy. With all that said, I am extremely excited to introduce you to our first speaker, who is our very own Eeman and is a member of the Redefined team. Eeman is a recent human rights law LLM graduate whose areas of interest are refugee law, international humanitarian law, and human rights law. She is a researcher and writer at Restless, an international human rights organization where she focuses on monitoring genocidal regimes and xenophobic landscapes. She has a passion for social justice, which inspired her to join Redefine, Learning for Lawyers. She is also a legal assistant at the United Nations House Scotland, a civil society organisation committed to strengthening the implementation of UN goals and values at a grassroots level. So I'll hand over to you, Eeman. We're really excited to hear you speak and thank you for being with us here today.
Thank you so much, Zainab, for the introduction. I'm very grateful to be here. I want to begin by acknowledging the shocking rise in anti-Muslim bigotry that has been protected and generated at the highest levels of governance. We're all familiar with countries such as America and the UK, which are symbols we can associate with anti-Muslim rhetoric, led and encouraged by their leaders, both insidiously and overtly. Such undisguised actions can be highlighted in the Trump era with the enactment of an anti-Muslim ban that sought an executive order to block refugees and travelers with passports from 7 Muslim-majority countries. I believe by solely discussing such frameworks of Islamophobia that we all may be aware exist in countries like this, we can gain a clear insight into how the existence of Islamophobia works. But such frameworks of discrimination and persecution transcend universally, and specific patterns are apparent in many, many countries. I'm looking forward to Mirza and Tasnima to give us a detailed case study from international examples of India and Indian-occupied Jammu and Kashmir. And I'd like to provide an insight into exploring the title of this event, and specifically what Islamophobic state-led frameworks mean, how these operate, as well as what this means to the contentious relationship between the freedom of religion and freedom of speech from a human rights lens. I believe this discussion on frameworks designed to target, otherize, limit, and in some cases erase Muslim faith is something that's incredibly difficult to listen to and to read about. And I want to try and be as eloquent as I can in unpacking Islamophobia as a central and universal issue of our time that can no longer be neglected or justified in any way. So before discussing the theme of the event, I think it's important to discuss the purpose of Islamophobia and what it means for those who deploy it. When speaking of the purpose, what needs to be clarified is that hatred, suspicion, fear, and a general avoidance of Islam and Muslims is something that is far broader and pervasive than street violence. The devastating cases of violence against Muslims manifesting their beliefs through their appearances, through the likes of their head coverings or beards, are attacks on both Muslimness and perceived Muslimness. I want to touch on both those terms just briefly. In 2018, the All-Party Parliamentary Group on British Muslims published a report which defined Islamophobia as a type of racism that targets expressions of Muslimness or perceived Muslimness. What's instantly clear is that Muslims are not a race. We are from different races, ethnicities, and backgrounds, but we are treated as if we are a race. We are stereotyped as races or stereotypes, and these are projected on us. A devastating example that highlights how far the stereotype transcends is that of a Sikh gas station owner in Arizona, who was the first man killed of a hate crime 4 days after 9/11. The man who murdered him simply stated, and I quote, that he wanted to kill some towel heads in revenge for 9/11. Thus, the avoidance, hatred, and fear of not only Muslims and Islam, but stereotypes of Muslimness is something created and instilled through structural roots at the highest forms of governance, where governments have shaped the way that citizens interact with Islam. Specifically, this has been exacerbated through the war on terror that we're all aware of, which has exclusively excused Islamophobia through criminalizing inherent parts of Islamic belief. Going back to the title, Islam versus the State, how Islamophobia has been excused is predominantly through anti-Muslim rhetoric, deep-rooted in legislation and policies that are legitimized by the state. These laws and policies are consistently perpetrating some of the following assumptions, like Islam causes violence. The more Islamic you are in outward belief and behavior, the more Islamic you are to be an extremist and of course, therefore commit violence. That Islam is an attack on the peaceful living of society because the outward belief and behavior disturbs the secular way of living. These form some of the principles rooted in insidious legal frameworks, symbolizing the sugar-coated forms of counterterrorism, of secularism. Such methods choose which of our beliefs are acceptable and make us good Muslims, and which dangerous beliefs that threaten the state's agendas make us bad Muslims. They are used to treat a Muslim population as an enabler and supporter of values that are opposing to whichever state they reside in. As such, in various countries like the UK, America, China, and France, Muslims are viewed as enablers of insurgency and terrorism. It's clear that these forms of Islamophobia are institutionalized and are linked to the erosion of the rule of law. In its simplest form, the rule of law means that no one is above the law. So for the rule of law to be effective, there must be equality and transparency under the law itself. Where a certain group's human rights are being compromised on the perception that the state is creating and is encouraging of them, then the state has very little respect for the basic premise of equality. Specifically, where laws are created on the premise of othering Muslims through imposing policies that underline their fundamental and very personal tenets of faith as malicious, violent, or threatening to the peace of society, the state then has total disregard of the peaceful manifestation of the right to freedom of religion. In legal terms, the right to freedom of religion is enshrined internationally in various covenants. It's under the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it's binding under the International Covenant of Cultural and Political Rights, and on the European level under the European Convention on Human Rights. It basically states that everyone has the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. So the right to adopt a religion or belief of their choice, as well as the freedom of manifesting it. Although there are limitations to the manifestation of this right, such limitations are only prescribed by law and necessary to various things like the protection of public safety, of public order, or of the fundamental rights and freedoms of others. So this signifies the high threshold needed to secure a strictly interpreted and proportionate limitation on the manifestation of the right. Its non-derogable status then cements the nature of the right to not be interfered with under international law. So it can only be limited if it is prescribed by law and is necessary for various rights and freedoms. The freedom of speech, like religion, is also enshrined in various covenants and conventions. It states that everyone shall have the right to hold opinions without interference, to freedom of expression, and the right to include freedom to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas of all kinds. But with these broad powers, it is also said there come special duties and responsibilities. So the right can be subject to restrictions, but these shall only be provided by law and are necessary. for the respect or rights of reputations of others, for the protection of national security or of public order or of public health. Now, taking these two rights into consideration, of the most prevalent examples of the turbulent relationship between these two rights and the consequent violation of the right to freedom of religion is France. And I'm sure most of you are aware. Despite France being a party to the European Convention on Human Rights and International Covenant on Cultural and Political Rights, meaning it is bound by the two rights I stated above, its continuous violation of the right to freedom of religion and defense of freedom of expression is evident. The blanket ban of the face veil, the full face veil, which targets niqab-wearing Muslim women, has been defended by the French government through the main secularist principle upheld by the notion of living together, in which an open society is required, and the full face veil allegedly curbs such a requirement. The French government state the purpose of the ban is three things: to promote equality between men and women, to respect for compliance with the minimal requirement of life in society, and the protection of public order. And they state that the rights of others to basic interaction or non-disturbance, which is not a fundamental right in any convention, by the way, is being infringed upon by niqab-wearing women. Contextually speaking, what essentially is the right to an interaction or the right to not be disturbed? Disturbed from what? The state has manufactured these phrases, as well as peaceful living and public order, as pillars that are only fulfilled where the Islamic faith is not present. The radicalization of the niqab, a piece of clothing, becomes more evident where the ban allows face coverings that are worn for reasons of health, professional grounds, as part of sporting, artistic, or traditional festivities or events, including religious processions, but it bans niqabs. As such, the Human Rights Council have argued that the state failed to justify, as France failed to justify, why such rights of peaceful living or public order would be unfairly obstructed by those wearing the niqab as a full face veil, but not by those covering their face in public through other numerous forms of face veil exempted by the Act. So an individual covering their face with a balaclava has the same effect of concealment as a woman covering her face with a niqab, but how is one accepted as an exception and the other becomes a disturbance which needs to be permanently removed in public? Clearly, there are no core rights of a democratic society being upheld in this instance, and this limitation of freedom of religion is neither necessary nor proportionate. The state furthers an Islamophobic agenda by instilling fear of niqab-wearing women when stating that this ban is for the purpose of public safety, so counterterrorism, to quickly identify suspects who travel in niqabs, which is necessary due to the several terrorist attacks that have taken place in France. There is a criminal sanction of a fine for those who do not comply with the ban. So essentially what this does is it takes an individual wearing a niqab, manifesting her faith and personal beliefs, and automatically deems her as a terrorist suspect till her face is revealed. Slowly, this transcends to any Muslim woman covering herself in any Islamic way. So every time someone sees a woman in niqab doing her groceries, a woman in a burqa picking up her children from school, or two women in a hijab strolling around the Eiffel Tower with their kids in the evening, they see them as terrorists and a threat to French public order and peaceful living. What derails after this is not just a thought that those people are terrorists, but what happens are physical attacks, ostracization, and persecution of an innocent minority, which is happening universally. I want to conclude by saying that if we are to address Islamophobia, we need to constantly challenge legislation and policies that legitimize it, no matter how sugar-coated these policies may appear. Change begins with a deep acknowledgement that street-level Islamophobic violence is simply a manifestation of a deeper structural malice led by states. Islamophobia Awareness Month is a month for all Muslims to speak up for the beauty of Islam in their everyday lives. But part of this beauty is showing courage. There must be a united and sustained demand for an end to the current Islamophobic legal framework. As a Muslim woman of faith, I want to share a quote from the Quran, which always resonates with me in trying times. Allah, which is the Arabic translation of God, says in the Quran, which is our holy scripture, "We shall test you with something of fear and hunger, some loss in goods, lives, and the fruits of your work. But give glad tidings to those who patiently persevere. Those who, when afflicted with calamity, say, "To Allah we belong and to Him is our return." They are those on whom descend blessings from their Lord in mercy. They are the ones who receive guidance. The injustices of Muslims universally, of our Muslim brothers and sisters universally, will devastatingly be never ending. But where we are persevering with patience and gratitude and committed action for these persecuted groups, and faith, be it in our gods or be it within our own communities, then hopefully no oppression or regime can ever dismantle that. Thank you.
Wow, Eeman, thank you so much for that empowering, passionate introduction to this topic, and just really hitting home why we at Redefined are doing what we're doing and why these conversations are so important to be had. So thank you so much for your contributions. I'm going to introduce our next fantastic speaker, which is Mirza. Hopefully you guys can all still see and everything's okay in terms of the tech. Only because I sometimes have bad days, but I can see people are still typing, so that's good. Thank you so much to Mirza for joining us. Mirza is a lawyer from Indian administered Kashmir. He is a Kofi Annan scholar at Mansfield College and an Oxford Weidenfeld-Hoffman scholar at the Blavatnik School of Government, University of Oxford. Mirza holds a postgraduate degree in law and has worked as a legal advisor for over 6 years in India, handling legal policy, regulation, and litigation. He regularly comments on legal and political issues concerning governance, legal reform, and state regulation. He is a prominent advocate for the restoration of the civil and political rights of the Kashmiri people. Over to you, Mirza, and thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. So I've been asked to try and stay as limited as possible in my use of legal jargon, and I'll try to do that. So my objective today is to give you an overview of the kind of dehumanization and depoliticization that takes place partly through the use of legal machinery, partly through the use of cultural machinery against Kashmiris and against Muslims in general also in India, which I'll touch upon. But with respect to Kashmir, I want to start off by telling you that oppression, discrimination, and dehumanization in Kashmir is nothing new. We have been oppressed for decades now. There has been a killing of innocent people, civilians, on a daily basis. And this all takes place in an overarching structure of draconian laws. There's an abject denial of fundamental rights, and we've experienced the world's longest curfews, the world's longest internet blockades, and thousands of people have been jailed without any judicial process. And in the few cases where there is a procedural judicial process, the judicial process itself does not meet any test of impartiality or of justice. And the reason I say that this is merely procedural is because you have the act of procedure where you can go to court and a judge will hear you. But if justice is not met, if justice is not dispensed in that procedural act, then it is just an act on paper. It is a facade. And this has been going on in Kashmir for many years now. But since I've been asked to speak about the policies against Muslims that are employed by the government, and I also want to discuss the normalization of this hate that is taking place. So before I come to this, I want to highlight that India's actions in Kashmir should not only be limited to a lens of Islamophobia, because we are under attack because of political demands that we make. And these are demands to be treated as equal human beings who have the capacity to decide what kind of state we want to live in. And there is little doubt that there is wide acceptance for the treatment that is meted out to Kashmiris because we lie outside the moral and legal compass of India. We are targeted more aggressively because we are Muslims and therefore dispensable, especially in the current political rhetoric in India. But I have little doubt that even if a non-Muslim group were to resist in a similar manner, the state would disregard the rule of law to deal with that group as well. But the difference is that there would be lesser acceptance of that treatment at a national level. And one example that comes out from India's history of resisting various movements, of suppressing various movements that resist the state, are, for example, the Sikh movement in India. The state apparatus suffers from a terrible crisis of morality and democracy. And it is most evident in the manner with which the state deals with challenges to its authority. And this crisis is most visible when the state is dealing with identities that the state does not consider of equal importance. And that is where our Muslim identity becomes heightened. One example of a difference which I can talk about in attitude towards dealing with Kashmir and any other place would be the way political spaces are controlled against a Muslim majority state. For those of you who don't know, Kashmir until last year was the only Muslim majority state in India. Last year, we were annexed by the Indian government and bifurcated into two parts, and we were converted to union territories. So, right now in India, legally speaking, there is no Muslim majority state. There are two union territories, which were the erstwhile state of Kashmir. So that bifurcation in itself also should indicate how the political apparatus and the state apparatus is employed to divide Muslims into manageable populations. So earlier we were the state of Jammu and Kashmir before August 5 last year. And now we've been divided into two parts, one which comprises of Leh and Kargil, and the other which comprises of the Kashmir Valley and Jammu. And this has been done to divide the Muslims of the state into manageable populations so that we're either of a lesser number or not a majority. So now the Muslims of Kargil are balanced out by the non-Muslims of Leh. And the Muslims of the Kashmir Valley are balanced out by the non-Muslims of Jammu. But even under the new arrangement, the Muslims of the valley outnumber the non-Muslims of that are present in Jammu in total population numbers. So, in effect, in order to depoliticize or take political control out of the hands of Muslim populations, the Indian government is now engaging in a process of delimitation by which they will change the number of constituencies, which is the number of elected representatives that can come from Jammu. And this will, in effect, create more political power in Jammu. The argument that the Indian government gives is that Jammu has more land area and therefore Jammu deserves more electoral seats. Kashmir has lesser land area, so lesser electoral seats. There is no place in the world where you will see delimitation taking place in order to give land more representation. Elections are not held to give land representation. Elections are held to give people representation. So it's a facetious argument to be making that because there is more land area in Jammu, it deserves more political seats. So, but this is the argument that has been given to us as of now, and the process is underway. The process of delimitation is right now underway as we speak. So we are already living within a system of oppression, and there's a great lack of accountability, which is geared against our political demands. Within that system, there is internalized individual bias, and that bias has greater room to be deployed in daily life, especially when it is supported by a state apparatus. For example, the armed forces search physically, they search people and they physically abuse people, especially people who are visibly Muslim. So if a bearded man in a Kashmir, in a public transport, like in a bus, if there's a bearded man, he has a greater chance of being harassed than other people. But they will stop and harass everyone, even if the Kashmiri is an atheist or whether he's a Muslim or he or she is a Muslim. So anyone who is visibly Muslim would be subject to the internalized bias of that soldier against people who meet a certain description. And this is the direct result. This internalized bias is a direct result of the disgust for Muslims that has been fostered by Indian leaders and their followers. And since 2014, since the new government, the BJP government came into power, there is a heightened, an active zeal with which Muslims in India are being re-educated to teach Muslims their place in society by openly calling for a Hindu Rashtra, which is a Hindu nation, by rarely punishing lynch mobs against whom there is video evidence, eyewitness testimony. There are cases where, in fact, one particularly gruesome case that I recall is that of Shambhu Lal Regar from Rajasthan, who had hacked a Muslim laborer. He hacked him to death on camera and lit his body on fire. And this person was arrested, but later was released on bail to campaign in the local elections. And there are many examples where people who are accused of lynching, mobs that are accused of lynching, have been released on bail and then garlanded by sitting ministers of the state. And such actions, when the state itself performs an action of garlanding someone or a group of people who are there in videos, who are there and against whom there's the case going on. These are not people who have been acquitted of the charges of murder. And if these people are garlanded by a sitting minister, so by a sitting representative of the state, it sends a message as to what the state is willing to approve and what the state is willing to suppress. So that in itself teaches, it's a re-education. And then again, there's a great zeal with which Muslim names of certain places are being changed. You might have heard of a place called Allahabad, and its name has been now changed to Prayagraj. So similar things are taking place in many regions in India. So mob lynching, the burning down of mosques, molestations, broad daylight killings, anti-Muslim citizenship acts, which are being passed by the central government, the riots in Delhi earlier this year, this discrimination, all of this is taking place on a daily basis. So there is nothing new about internalized Islamophobia in the common citizenry, as well as in the way in which legislation, state legislation, is being used to disenfranchise and make Muslims into separate classes of citizens. And it's also essential to understand the ecosystem in which this normalization is taking place. Because since there is nothing new about this dehumanization, the point which is alarming right now is the scale at which this normalization is taking place. The scale of it is truly horrifying right now, because the level of the rhetoric, the shrill rhetoric that we are subject to, the level of that rhetoric is increasing every year, because that rhetoric, the level becomes normalized, and the next year you see a heightened form of state aggressiveness, of state rhetoric against minorities. So it's essential to try and grapple with the kind of ecosystem we're dealing with, to give you an idea of how this normalization is taking place. Because in any normal state, in any normal, reasonable, rational country, there are always biases in the populations. There can be internalized biases, but those are kept in check either by the media or by a judicial system. But justice in India has always been a very elastic concept, and its elasticity is suited to meet political demands. So in a sense, it only stretches when it's politically expedient for it to be stretched and cover within its expanse all the minorities and all the vulnerable populations. But if you look around the world right now, it'll give you an idea of where the state is trying to fit itself in the flow of a larger rhetoric. So around the world, there is growing intolerance right now, and Islamophobia, as well as an acceptance of authoritarianism. Right now, there are 6 nations in Europe that have banned the burqa: Austria, Denmark, France, Belgium, Latvia, Bulgaria. Boris Johnson in the UK claimed that women in burqas look like bank robbers and letterboxes. The Dutch parliamentarian Geert Wilders, he had called for banning the Quran, and authoritarians around the world are relying on similar strategies to grab power. Whether you look at Orban in Hungary, you look at Maduro in Venezuela, you look at Zuma in South Africa, Duterte in Philippines, Trump in US, and Modi in India, they are all relying on similar strategies of reducing governance to a question of us versus them. They are vilifying vulnerable groups and dismantling any checks on their power by rewarding loyalists and by provoking violence. The same strategy has been used in India, and the road to this success is always paved with obedience. When people obey power without questioning them, that is what leads to this path. Now, where do you feel that this growing acceptance is then coming from? And like I mentioned earlier, that it's coming one from direct legislation of the state, as well as by influencing social spaces, which are online as well as offline in the real world. So if you look at how technology has been used right now in India, you look at Bollywood, the depiction of Muslims in Bollywood as some sort of beastly, inhuman creatures who have weird sexual tendencies, insatiable desires, as if to portray a certain kind of beastly or inhuman depiction. So you also look at tech monopolies like Facebook, where hate content is being allowed to continue and persist, whereas the content that resists that hate is being suppressed. I'm not sure how many may have followed this recent case where Anki Das, she was the head of public policy for Facebook in India. She resigned just a few weeks ago. I think 3 weeks ago, she resigned after a protracted scandal where it emerged, and this only emerged because of leaked internal emails, that she had resisted banning of content by an elected member of the BJP who was calling for killing of Muslims and various aggression, violence against Muslims. She had resisted taking action against him because she felt it will be bad for business in India because he's connected to the ruling party. So effectively, you see a direct relationship between profit and hate. And at the same time, when you try and see what content has she tried to suppress, you see that there are Kashmiri activists who are trying to voice what is happening in Kashmir, who are trying to give the alternate narrative on the reality of what is taking place in Kashmir. Because the only narrative that is publicly accessible is a narrative which is approved by the government of India. So the only way Kashmiris can resist that narrative is by using all other available spaces, which is social media or public spaces like the one which I'm using right now, to challenge what the government is saying. And if the government's narrative is one of truth, it will survive. But if it is not, then the government will try to suppress all kinds of dissent against it. But not just these online spaces. If you look at how advertises are being constructed and resisted right now. So Netflix, this is a recent controversy where Netflix has a TV show which depicts a kiss between a Muslim and a non-Muslim. There's an interreligious couple. There's tremendous resentment against this depiction right now in the name of what is being called love jihad, which is a concept which has been coined by an imaginary concept, which is coined by leaders of the BJP, claiming that Muslim men are trapping Hindu women to fall in love with them in order to convert them. And just a few days ago, there are states in India which are now planning to pass laws against love jihad. Now, what this does is it depicts, it creates, and it reinforces existing biases. So there's also one ad which was by a jewelry manufacturer called Tanishq, which had depicted an interfaith marriage. And there was tremendous resistance against that. There were calls to boycott the store. And eventually the brand pulled out the ad itself. There's also an ad that just came out yesterday, which is for warm clothing. And it depicts a Kashmiri protagonist as a thief over there. So all of this, it reinforces certain biases inside minds of people, and it reinforces that ecosystem. And you have that echo chamber, which is resonating with a bias that you hold, it'll reinforce those biases. So this is something which is taking place in the online or the virtual world. But if you look at the offline world, then you see how government is using an overarching structure of law to singularly target a certain community, a certain identity. There's a reason why Umar Khalid is in jail right now under sedition law, whereas other people who may have done much worse, such as BJP leaders who have given hate speeches, called for killing of Muslims, there is no anti-terrorism law that is being invoked against them. There is sedition law, which is used against dissent. And this is probably the only part of this discussion where I'll be discussing certain specific laws. But I thought that it will be relevant to talk about the UAPA, which is the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act. It is an anti-terrorism legislation, but it has routinely been used against journalists for reporting the news, or even when journalists, Kashmiri journalists, have posted certain photos on their own social media. And these are photos which have already been published in reputed magazines and journals and newspapers from around the world. The Washington Post, in New York Times, in the Time magazine, Al Jazeera, around the world, they've already been published. There's a journalist who has republished them on their own social media. Those people have been charged with the UAPA. And it's a draconian legislation under which you can be subject to a jail term for a very long time. Also in Kashmir itself, we have the Public Safety Act, under which you can be jailed for up to 2 years without a trial, and you have no access to lawyers under this law, because and no Miranda rights exist against it. By Miranda rights, I mean you have a right to be presented before a judge when you're arrested, when your liberty is suspended. You have a right that within 24 hours you should be presented before a judicial magistrate. But under the Public Safety Act, you have no legal representation. You cannot be represented by a lawyer, because this is administrative detention, and you're not being jailed. But it is just a cosmetic difference. Essentially, your freedom has been suspended. And there are people in Kashmir who have been in and out of jail for nearly 2 decades now, because the order of public safety gets renewed every time they go out. So they go out, spend some time, and the new order comes with the same charges. And in some cases, even the charges are not declared to the people who are arrested, who are detained. In the last year, there are thousands of Kashmiris who were detained in this manner, and there's no legal action that has been successful against this mass incarceration. So in the online world, of course, this means that academics, activists, any dissenters they can get banned, they can get invisibilized without any justifiable reason. But in the offline world, what this means is that there is a state sponsored, a state machinery, which is going to remove you out of circulation, because your ideas in the offline world also cannot circulate, and your ideas in the online world also cannot circulate. So I'll just conclude with giving you just three examples of what kind of content has been permitted to circulate online. I've told you what kind of content is not being permitted. What has been permitted, just with respect to the case of Facebook, there are three specific cases where Anki Das had hesitated in taking action. The first is against T. Raja. He is a state legislature from Telangana, and he had threatened to kill Muslims who ate cows. He threatened to shoot Rohingya Muslims who are fleeing from Myanmar in a globally recognized crisis. The second is that of a BJP member of parliament, Anant Kumar Hegde, who has extensively used his Facebook page to allege that Muslims are spreading COVID-19 in India in a conspiracy to wage what he has called Corona Jihad. And you will be, I mean, it's sometimes amused. It would have been amusing if this was not a lived reality for us. How the term jihad is just clubbed with any other activity, and it's thrown around as if Muslims are engaging in some kind of activity which is harassing. In fact, I remember just a few weeks ago there was a news report in India where the news reporter claimed that Muslims are waging IAS jihad. IAS stands for Indian Administrative Services. It is the civil services exam in India. And he was claiming that there are lots of Muslims who are getting into these exams, who are clearing these exams, and this means Muslims are studying too much and they're grabbing seats which are meant for other people. So this is IAS jihad. So there's a fear mongering which is being created in the minds of people. So this is the example of Anant Kumar Hegde. And there are many similar examples which are not of prominent people, but they are present in society. But when state actors themselves, when state representatives themselves are holding this as a standard, what is left to expect of common public over there? So all institutions that could protect people, that could protect vulnerable populations, have now collapsed. So society is always held up by this belief that if you are maligned, or if you are acted against in any negative manner, if a state machinery acts against you, your faith in your society is held up by this belief that you can access the court and the court will redress the loss or the harm that you suffered. Or you can access a justice system, a political system, a media system. When these things collapse, your faith in that society also collapses. And that is the end of democracy. That is where India has arrived right now. For Kashmiris, that moment arrived many, many years ago. But this is a call for common Indians now to realize that what Kashmiris have been saying, that this is a threat, which it's not just we who face that threat, it's all people. Because if you have been silent at this treatment which has been meted out to Kashmiris, eventually it will come for you as well. And that's where India is right now, where even poets, Vara Vara Rao is an 80-year-old poet who has Parkinson's disease. He has been in jail for a few months now, and I think just 2 weeks ago the court allowed him to be released because he's now on his deathbed. He has contracted COVID, his kidneys have failed, he has brain hemorrhage. So in court, the judge, the lawyer who was arguing for just humane treatment, said that we all have a right to a humane death. And on that basis, because now his death is imminent, he has been allowed to leave the jail premises. But there are so many other activists, Sudha Bharadwaj, Arun Ferreira, so many people who are fighting for basic civil and political fundamental rights of Indian people in general, not just of Muslims, but they're also in jail right now. And who is out there? People like people who have hacked Muslims to death on camera. They are out there campaigning for the ruling party. So what is shocking is not that the state is allowing it to happen. What is shocking is that these campaigns are then successful. India now has someone who's accused of terrorism elected from one of the states in India. Pragya Thakur she's a state representative. She has been convicted of terrorism. She's not just an accused. She's been convicted in a past case. So this is where we are right now. That the state of affairs is so abysmal that there is very little left to expect from the state to redress itself. The only expectation that we have now is if citizens themselves realize the monster that is being created, which is there to engulf them as well. That could be a realization, a wake-up call. Although I would definitely argue that self-preservation should not be a parameter for awakening. You should not awaken just because you are also threatened now. should awaken because it is the right thing. It is the just and morally correct thing to do. And that moment, that ship has sailed many years ago. But there is still scope and we can still resist. And we hope that any Indians who are conscientious, who understand what is happening, can use their privilege of being Indians to stand up against what their governments are doing, what they are doing in their name. I'm happy to take any questions that you may have towards the end. Sorry if I've exceeded my time, but yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Wow, Mirza, that was fantastic. You are obviously a fount of all knowledge when it comes to this subject matter. Thank you so much for sharing your account, your experience, your insights. I feel like we're probably going to have to invite you back to do your very own mini summer school or something, winter school for us. But so much to think about. And I think for me, one thing that your presentation really draws out is something that I battle with a lot myself as a lawyer, which is, you know, the mainstream narrative is that law is good, that we use it for good things. It's there to protect, you know, communities, vulnerable people, marginalized groups. But actually, there are countless examples of how law is actually used to oppress. And I'm really interested in this notion of what does that mean for us as lawyers, and how do we navigate these systems that, you know, we're in a system which is actually perpetuating these injustices. So from my own perspective, I'd be really pleased to hear your insights when we get to the Q&A later on, and maybe you can shed some light on my own crisis.
Just one clarification. I think I said that Pragya Thakur had been convicted. She's been accused of terror charges. In the 2000, there's a 2008 case against her, which is still undergoing trial. But she's not been convicted yet, but she's an accused in a terror case.
Okay, thank you
just
for that.
To clarify that.
No problem at all. Thank you so much. That brings us on to our last speaker, who I'll introduce for you all, Tasnima. Tasnima is currently studying a master's in law at BPP University. She is a writer, speaker, reader, and campaigner. Earlier this year, she was listed in the top 50 most empowering new gen activists by Glamour magazine. She has co-founded Nidur Manush, which is an independent campaigning group, and she is also the project lead at Restless Beings, an international human rights organization working with communities that have had their citizens stripped in Assam. Her areas of interest include race, gender, abolition, and citizenship. And with all that, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Zina and Redefined for inviting me. So today I'm going to be talking about obviously what's going on in Assam, the NRC and anti-terror laws, and how Islamophobia has manifested within that state, and what exactly does that mean for Muslims today in India. Now, to understand what is happening in Assam, it's almost imperative that we look back at the past and we look into the historical context and social structures that have been built over the years that have allowed ultimately Indian Muslims now to be called foreigners in their own country. So Assam is located in the northeast region of India, and in 1947, after the partition of India, East Bengal became East Pakistan, and as a result of that, Bengalis living in Assam almost overnight became illegal immigrants. And before the implementation of such borders, India and Pakistan, the British colonial administration actually encouraged migrants from Bengal at that time to migrate to Assam in a bid to generate higher land revenue. Now, 3 years after the partition and the creation of India and Pakistan, the Immigrants Expulsion from Assam Act was formulated, and this act provided for the expulsion of certain migrants from Assam, and that meant that around 40,000 Bengali were being ultimately pushed out over the border into East Pakistan at that time. And the Foreigners Act in 1946 defined a foreigner as one who was not a natural born or naturalized British subject during colonial times. And now this creation of foreigner is only really possible now because of the creation of the citizen. And that begs the question also, who is allowed to be an Indian citizen right now? And around like 1962, the government of India again ordered to deport all these illegal Pakistanis, which then came via the PIP scheme, which is the Prevention of Infiltration of Pakistani scheme. And now under this act, again, approximately 250,000 Bengali Muslims were again being pushed out of Assam and into Bengal, reinforcing this idea that this community does not belong in Assam, whereas, you know, the Bengalis, you know, they're indigenous to Assam. They've also been there since the 1800s, or, you know, before in colonial times. But the Indian government at the time, and because of, you know, xenophobia that was building up at that time, they pushed, you know, thousands of Bengali Muslims into Bengal, what's known as Bangladesh today anyway. Now, in 1971, obviously Bangladesh became an independent country, and during the 9 months of genocide inflicted by West Pakistan, millions of refugees fled to either West Bengal or over to the northeastern region of India, where Assam is. And at this time, Assam saw around 500,000 Bengali refugees enter the state. And these Bengalis that were crossing into Assam at that time were mainly Hindu. They were persecuted Hindus that crossed over. Now, this sudden influx of refugees at that time, around 1970s, led to what is known as the 6-year Assam agitation movement. And this was basically an anti-foreigners movement, and this was started by ASU, the All Assamese Students' Union, and this lasted for 6 years until 1985. Now, this 6-year Assam agitation was changed the dynamics within Assam, and suddenly the problem of illegal Bangladeshis was popularized, and even today still has not left political discourse across India. And ASU's impact within Assam is, you know, far-reaching, but their biggest achievement really was their ability to frame this issue of immigration and illegal Bangladeshis in a legal and constitutional dimension. And their movement was able to mobilize the Assamese middle class, teacher union, student union, villagers, gardeners, indigenous tribes, and they all kind of generated this general consensus between all these different groups that the problem, in fact, was actually just illegal Bangladeshis. And these, you know, this community was a political and social hindrance. That's what they were going off anyway. And by only targeting this specific group, because there were other migrants in Assam at that time, especially from Nepal and stuff, but there was, you know, Bengali migrants were the majority then. But by only targeting this group, the Assam agitation, you know, found it much easier to drive political support, basically, and to garner public sympathy. And, you know, by directing their ethno-nationalism on this one group, somehow now, you know, the public discourse around Bangladeshi immigrants became justified. And this movement, which might not be much talked about now, really gained a lot of momentum at that time in India, and, you know, didn't look like slowing down at all, which is why the government of India had to, you know, couldn't possibly ignore their concerns anymore. And the 6-year Assam agitation was, you know, one of the most violent times within Assam. And you know, even though this movement weren't explicitly against Muslims, because there were Assamese Muslims at that time that were involved in this anti-foreigners movement as well, the issue of citizenship was amplified and connected to the issue of religion when against Muslims. So, in the years between partition and the Assam Accord, Bengali Muslims were the one that were vilified and deported. And this movement, again, controlled the parameters around language, meaning that they controlled almost the power within this debate. The notion of illegal Bangladeshi as opposed to illegal Bengali was purposely used to indicate and distinguish the Muslim faith of the migrants. And, although ASU, or the All Assamese Students Unions knew the connotations using the labels Bangladeshi came with, they utilized, these pre-existing communalism and anti-Muslim sentiment to mobilize masses to join the movement. And, even today, when, in India, when the term Bangladeshi is brought up, again, is basically a synonym for a Muslim when they're talking about Bangladeshis and legal Bangladeshi immigration into India anyway. And again, during this 6-year Assam agitation, there were multiple organized ethnic cleansing and several massacres that took place, and they were all targeting these Bengali migrants. And it's important to note that these weren't just Muslims that they were being targeted, Bengali Hindus as well, that majority, came in the 1970s around the Liberation War. They were also being targeted in an ethnic cleansing campaign. And, one that really stood out was the Nelly massacre. And this massacre specifically targeted Bengali Muslims. And this massacre was described as one of the worst in post-colonial India, with over 3,000 Muslims being killed. And unofficial figures, say it was as high as 10,000 sometimes. And, despite the severity of such an event and even the international coverage that was, surrounding this massacre, the local newspapers, published, single columns of few paragraphs the next days, saying it was a tragedy. But again, they called the victims of that massacre immigrants. And again, that process of otherizing this community almost at that time justified such an event. And so after the 6-year Assam agitation, and because of the momentum that was building, and the government of India couldn't ignore their concerns anymore. So they signed the Assam Accord, which was signed in August 1985 between the leaders of this basically ethno-nationalist movement and the government. And the decision to engage with this movement on the issue of foreigners was made by Congress Party. So I think that's important to note as well, because, when you're talking about Islamophobia and the NRC and Assam, obviously the BJP do come up, but it was actually the Congress Party that, decided to engage with the student union and decided to create the Assam Accord at that time. And essentially the accord established a cutoff date for Indian citizenship in Assam. And the government of India wanted the Assam Accord to categorize migrants by 3 different cutoff dates. Migrants who came before the 1st of January 1966. And these people that came, their presence was to be regularized. And then the second groups were those people that came after 1966, but before the 25th of March 1971, which is a day before the start of the Bangladeshi Liberation War. So they did that on purpose because they wanted to cut off all these Bengali, especially Hindus at that time, that did cross over to the border. And the third was those who came after 1971, and those people that did come after 1971 were just the government just wanted them deported back to Bengal. And so because of the Assam Accord was signed and the government of India was, taking notice of what was happening in Assam now, loads of different legislation was enacted basically. And, in 1986, the detection and deportation began. And this was, you know, an intense government, you know, state-led operation to, again, deport and detect Bengali Muslims and Hindus that were living there. And again, in 1999, the NRC, the National Register of Citizens, as per of the, it was, there was a movement now that the NRC was to be updated, basically. And again, Assam is also one of the only regions in India that actually has detention centres. And the first of these detention centres came in the early 2000s. And around 1,000 or more foreigners are, you know, housed in these detention centres. But actually, these people that are in the detention centres are literally poor people that living in poor Bengalis that are living in Assam that don't have correct identification because poor people don't have the access to that. That's literally the reason why. So these detention centers are literally filled with Indian citizens. And the Supreme Court began the process of updating this National Register of Citizens in 2013. The final list of that came out in last year around August, the end of August. And this excluded 1.9 million people from the list. And what this means is basically they went around Assam and there was like a very strict process on the, you know, classification of indigenous Assamese. You know, when did you come here? You need proof, etc. Again, a lot of the refugees and migrants that did come over during colonial times and even in the 70s, they don't have the papers to even prove that they are an Indian citizen. And those people were effectively, you know, put on the list and are now awaiting trial to prove that they are actually an Indian citizen, even though, you know, their grandfathers and great grandfathers were born in Assam. So it's a very flawed, system. The NRC process is a very flawed system, and the majority of the 2 million people that were excluded and are on the list are Bengalis, and there's, you know, Nepalese migrants as well. There's indigenous as well. They're just people who the majority don't see as Indian citizens. They don't fit the realm of what they think an Indian citizen should be. So in the context of today, the RSS and BJP have basically been replicating these anti-Muslim politics of the Assamese students' unions, and they have been trying to appeal to the Bengali Hindus within Assam. And their plea to the Bengali Hindus were basically that the Citizenship Amendment Act will help them, help them stay in India, basically. And the Citizenship Amendment Act basically fast tracks Indian citizenships for Hindus, Sikhs, Buddhists, Christians, Parsis and Jains, and, you know, basically not Muslims. And that really means is that from the 1.9 people that have had their citizenship stripped because they've been on the NRC list, that means that all the Muslims that are on those lists will effectively have their citizenship stripped. And they will be either told to go back to Bangladesh, even though they're not born there, their parents weren't born there, you know, their grandparents weren't born there. That's literally an alien, you know, country to them. And obviously, last year when, you know, the Citizenship Amendment Act, or this year, sorry, when the Citizenship Amendment Act was introduced, there were loads of protests going on. And there were loads of protests by the Assamese against that because they didn't want Bengali Hindus to also basically stay in Assam as well. You know, the xenophobia from Assam and effectively throughout the whole of India, they view, you know, Bangladeshis as illegal and as Muslims and just not belonging in India, basically. And, you know, this xenophobia has not just, you know, creeped into the legal systems within India, but the way the legal systems is set up, you know, the legal system is basically set up in you know, against those who they deem as foreigners, but the legal system is actively working to install acts that make it easier to target migrant communities, legalizing their otherness. You know, the NRC that took place in Assam, you know, the BJP's plan is basically to replicate the NRC and put it in different states across India. So, you know, you're going to see maybe in the next few years, you know, thousands of communities basically being stripped of their citizenship and having nowhere to go. And, you know, it's, yeah, that's all I have to say. Basically, it's just a scary time for India right now.
Tasnima, thanks so much for that presentation and kind of the historical perspectives that inform the modern day and the current situation that we're in. So super important to understand where we've been, to understand where we are, and also where we're going, because unfortunately, I think one of the things that we all can say is that history seems to consistently repeat itself in various ways, and you know, we never seem to learn from any of these travesties. There was so much in what you said that I'd never even heard of, like the Nelly massacre. And that for me is really frightening, because I'm sure collectively we're all on this conversation because we're passionate about these issues. We've maybe studied these issues, we've worked on these issues. And if we, people like us, don't even know what the heck is going on, what does that say for like the everyday person that maybe isn't as interested or engaged? And I think it just really highlights why it's so important to have these types of conversations where we can talk about issues that just aren't platformed in the same way and aren't given the same airtime. So I'm so incredibly grateful to all three of you for your fantastic insights and presentations, and for just allowing us to hold this space where we can talk about some of the issues that are going on in the world. And they're obviously not, you know, they're just a microcosm and a very small snapshot of some of the very systemic global issues that we've got at the moment, but a really helpful taster. So with that said, we've got about 25 minutes for Q&A. We've had some questions put in the Q&A chat, which we can run through. And if anybody's got any other kind of observations or reflections they'd like to share, then please do so. In the meantime, I'm just gonna scroll back up. I think the questions were from Aksa, I think, who was very much loving these presentations, I think. Aksa, do you wanna unmute yourself and ask the questions? If she's still there. I think she's still there. Is she still there? Oh, okay, here's she. Oh, she's got a sore throat. Okay, no problem. So, Aksa's first question was, or one of the questions, do you think that with a new US non-Trump government, there could be some sort of positive international community propelled movement for Kashmir? A pathetic, idealistic question maybe, but worth asking. I think that was for Mirza.
Would you want me to take it right now, or?
Yeah, if you don't mind.
Sure. Yeah, I don't mind at all. Well, it's a good question, and it's good to be hopeful that there may be some change. But so just to give you guys some more background about where I'm coming from on this, I have interacted with the Biden campaign when he was running for election, and I was advising them on how to handle this issue on Kashmir, and I was giving them my perspective on this. The Biden campaign has definitely spoken more than what the Trump campaign spoke of on Kashmir, and more positively. But it definitely leaves a lot to be desired, because the standard that has been set by the opposition, or the incumbent president at the time during the elections, was so low. The threshold was so low that any kind of talk on even acknowledging basic human rights was appreciated. And I don't expect much to change, sadly, because international diplomacy is very transactional in nature. And India is a very large market, especially we are looking at an economy post-COVID, where the world is going to be dealing with a financial crisis. So it's going to be very expensive to take a moral position against against a place where you can economically benefit from. But I feel that if we were to push this towards a moral arc, the argument should be that all citizens of US, of UK, of powerful nations should question what kind of nations they want to create. Do you want to tomorrow, in the light of history, do you want to be recognized as a nation that sacrificed moral values in lieu of economic deals, or a better platform, or a better economic deal? In exchange for that, is it better to be a nation like, is it okay, is it acceptable to be a nation that sacrificed moral values? Or would you rather want to be known as a nation which stood up for what was historically right, and come out on the right side of history? I don't see that happening in the world that we inhabit right now. But definitely with a Biden administration, we can at least sit down on a table to discuss. We can try and push them, or even test them, tell them to uphold the values that they campaigned on. With a different, for example, with the Modi administration in India, there is no scope of negotiation. With maybe a different administration, you may at least be able to speak, although in the context of Kashmir, there hasn't been much difference between, say, the Congress and the BJP, because essentially both of them accept dehumanization and depoliticization of Kashmiris and of Muslims in general, except that the Congress is more suave and politically well established in doing this. And the BJP is very obvious and blatant, and that's their selling point also. That's why they are liked, because they're more in your face and they're more aggressive, and they make it possible, similarly as Trump did in the US, they make it possible for your internal biases, which people would hold within closed circles, or only in their mind, only in their thoughts. It became acceptable to say those things and do those things in public. So that's what changes between the two. But essentially, both are expansionist governments that do not believe in giving civil and political rights to Kashmiris. And both do not believe, and they both don't empower Muslims, such as, because the last 70 years under Congress have already shown that. There's a report that I'd urge you guys to read if you have the time. It's called the Sachar Committee report, which is a 2006 report, which shows the economic parity of all groups in India, all castes and various economic groups, in which Muslims are placed even under Dalits in India. Muslims in India are the lowest economically, despite the fact that there may be some elite Muslims also in that classification. So even the elite Muslims do not balance out the level of poverty, the level of abject poverty that Muslims in general are subject to. So both governments, both parties are similar. With respect to Trump and Biden, of course, it might be in some ways less of an eyesore to see Biden speak, but essentially things will not change drastically. The only expectation I have is that Modi went to the US to campaign for Trump, and if the Biden administration will remember that, they might press Modi more on human rights violations. That is a hope that we also have.
Fantastic. Thanks so much for that response, Mirza. People feel free to continue to put any comments or questions in the chat. I think one of the pre-submitted questions that we had, bearing in mind that this is a platform that often works with aspiring lawyers or people quite junior on in their profession, what advice would the speakers give to people that are interested in these types of issues, want to get involved, but perhaps have limited platform or opportunity to really, or they feel to do anything? Is there any advice that you would give for people at that level to try and engage with these issues? I might come to Tasnima first on that, if that's okay, because I know that you've been involved with so much activism and campaigning in your time. So any thoughts you had would be great.
Yeah, I think to answer that question, firstly, I don't think you need a platform really to campaign or getting involved in activism. I think the people that are, doing the most work are probably without platforms anyway. I think, you know, in terms of me and how I got involved in activism, I think, you know, one of the most important questions you can ask yourself is, you know, what, so like, who is already doing the work that you want to get involved in, basically, and what kind of resources do you have, and, you know, do you have the time and space to basically commit to this, you know, campaign or you know, activism, etc. So for me is, you know, I looked at, you know, I found campaigns or people that I know that are working in fields that I wanted to get involved with. I contacted them myself. I, you know, asked them literally the same question, you know, how do I get involved, etc. And at that time, you know, you know, again, I came across Restless Beings, got involved in that, and then, you know, slowly, you know, became the project lead on Assam. In terms of, you know, creating Nijo Manush, the campaign is, again, I asked myself if I have the resources and what exactly do I want to change, and what field am I going down, and are people around there already doing the work, because I don't want to, you know, step over anybody's you know, contributions or efforts, etc. So, you know, for Nijo Manush, for example, I got in contact with loads of academics, people that I thought that would be, you know, interested in, for example, the Bangladeshi community, and we literally just formed a group like that. And I think so many of it is down to you creating opportunities for yourself, and going, you know, I think putting yourself out there in the way that, you know, asking questions, going to people that you admire and asking them, you know, how do you do that? Or, you know, how, you know, what steps are there in place to do that? I hope that answered that question.
Yeah, that's super helpful, Tasnima, because I know that piece of advice that I always give to people in terms of the whole becoming a lawyer thing, it's very much the same kind of thing, like go and stalk people that you like the look of, that do cool work, try and like LinkedIn them, and all of that. So that's super helpful. I'm really pleased that we've got you on here in terms of to represent Restless Beings, which remains a organisation and community that is very close to my heart. I know that you guys often are like recruiting or putting calls out for opportunities for like students and stuff like that. Is that something that's still kind of open in case there are people on here that are interested in getting involved?
Yeah, definitely. I think we're always looking for activists, campaigners, and even if you don't have any history at all with anything, but you just want to get involved because you care about, you know, specific projects and stuff, all you have to do is literally email one of the team, and, you know, we have like a indoor policy where whoever applies, they usually get in and become a team member. And it's honestly, it has changed my life in a lot of different ways. I've only, you know, I only started it in 2017, but, you know, after a year, you know, I went to Assam myself with Mabra and Rahima, and we, you know, created and laid down the foundation for the Assam project now, which I'm working on, which is something, you know, I've always been interested in. So yeah,
I think that's really amazing. Yeah, and I mean, you're way younger and cooler than I am, but I joined RB in 2010, which is when I had just graduated. So I think finding a community in a space at that stage of kind of my life, similar to you, it impacted my journey into like law and activism and stuff in such a powerful way. And it's something that you carry on with you even when you're like, you know, more old and haggard like I am now. But that experience kind of is really foundational. So yeah, anybody that's interested in Restless Beings or finding out more about them, no doubt Tasnima will be happy to hear from you. Eeman has very recently joined their team as well. So yeah, definitely check out their work. That they're really, really great people, and yeah, you guys should definitely do that. I'm just seeing if there's any other questions on the chat. I can see that there's like people sharing their socials and stuff like that. An interesting one. Okay, so there's a question which says, is there a movement for the world to officially recognize Islamophobia? in the way anti-Semitism has been officially accepted to exist. Is there anyone that feels like they're keen to come in on that? Eeman, maybe? Or Mirza, sorry, Mirza's unmuted himself, so Mirza.
I can, the only thing I can address is that there have been calls, various world leaders have written extensively in the past month, especially in light of what happened in France and how, what the action that the government took. Because France had two options at that time. They could either say that we want to unite people into respecting each other. So we respect the freedom of opinion, freedom of thought, as well as we respect people's sentiment towards religion and towards how they perceive how they are being attacked. And we don't want that to happen. But instead, they chose a different path. So in light of that, many world leaders wrote about it extensively, but there isn't a concerted movement around the world. And this is also because of a crisis of leadership in the Islamic world. And when we say the Islamic world, we have to understand that there are certain, when France refers to Islamic world's sentiment, they are trying to say that the Islamic world is less interested, or Muslims in general are less interested in emphasizing or protecting freedom of speech, which is not true. And they are using isolated examples from what is called the Islamic world of leaders who are authoritarian or who do not allow dissent in their respective countries for their own political interests. So they use them as examples to say that, look, this Islamic world, they don't care about freedom of speech, and we are here, we want freedom of speech and everything. So if you look at the way their courts interpret their version of secularism, you also see that there are tremendous biases and there's tremendous issues on that. There are cases where the headscarf has been found to be an illegal expression of religion, but wearing a cross has been found to be an expression of culture. And since it's a small, and this is it's a court case in France, which was on this incident. So there are various such examples that you see, but I don't see a concerted effort from leaders of Muslim countries to come together on a common platform. There are many fractures within this group of various ideological differences. And because of that, there isn't a concerted effort. Say the OIC could take a stand on it if they had that interest. But the OIC has never taken a stand, a proper, clear stand, even on Kashmir. Even when, in fact, the only time in recent months that they took a stand on an issue which was affecting Muslims was when India was vilifying Muslims, calling it Corona Jihad. Then the OIC made a statement on it, and Modi very quickly tweeted in response to that, saying that no, COVID affects everyone irrespective of caste, creed, religion. So you see that they have some kind of leverage which they can utilize if they wish to, but they haven't done it till now. And there isn't enough movement or pressure from the citizens within the Islamic world to ask them to leverage their powers in that direction.
Thank you for coming in on that, Mirza, I really appreciate it. Eeman, I'm going to come to you for probably what will be the last question, and it's really whether you think that there are other examples of some of these themes that we've discussed today in other case studies or other countries, other regions, that people that have joined us might be interested in hearing about or going and pursuing and learning more about, and any that you might suggest for people to kind of consider and think about.
Yeah, for sure. I think the most prominent example we have is China's cultural genocide against the Uyghur Muslims that many of us have come to know in the last 2 or 3 years. But what I want to say is China has used the global war on terror as a cover for its increasingly brutal suppression of the Uyghur people since 9/11. I mean, within weeks of 9/11 attacks happening, the Chinese government went to the UN and announced that where America is fighting Al-Qaeda, the Chinese government is fighting an offshoot of Al-Qaeda called the ETIM, the East Turkestan Islamic Movement, that no one had ever heard of, no Human Rights Watch, no Chinese Watch, no one. And by 2002, the UN and the US had listed this as a terrorist organization. So from then till now, nearly 2 decades later, of the 11 million Uyghurs living in China, Uyghur Muslims living in China, more than 1 million of them have been detained in so-called re-education camps, and have become victims of what has become the largest program of mass incarceration and surveillance in this world, solely based from the root of their faith, because they are Muslims.
Thank you, Eeman, for kind of bringing that in. And that's a really important case study that, you know, it's good to see that it's getting into the mainstream media now, but I know that this has been an issue for decades, and it's something that requires urgent international intervention. So thank you for that. I think with that, I'll begin to draw the event to a close. So first of all, again, thank you so much to our fantastic speakers. Thank you to you all for joining us for this conversation. I'm really interested to know for how many of you this was your first redefined event. Would you mind like using one of those emoji reaction things and letting me know? Because we'd be quite keen to kind of gauge how many people have joined us for the first time. Cool, so I'm seeing some thumbs up, which is cool. Okay, so quite a few of you, so welcome. Hopefully we'll see you on future events. And I guess my next question is, how many of you are lawyers or aspiring lawyers? Interesting, so we haven't got, so okay. Cool, so there's actually less thumbs up for that. So in the chat, do people mind just putting like vaguely what you do, what you're interested in, what you kind of, what brought you to this chat? That would be really helpful, because my next plug is going to be for our next event for Islamophobia Awareness Month, although it's happening in December. The link has been put in the chat by Rabia. It's called Muslim Lawyers Navigating Faith and Practice, 2nd of December. And what we're doing there is we've curated a panel of Muslim lawyers to really talk about how they've navigated, first of all, the profession as a Muslim, which is often an exclusive and exclusionary space, but also to deal with any instances of Islamophobia they may have faced, either directly or insidiously. So if there are any people here that are either aspiring lawyers or lawyers just wanting to hear from others about how they deal with that topic, those areas, please feel free to register for that event. We'd love to have you. And again, if it's not your thing because you're not an aspiring lawyer, but you know people who might benefit from that, please feel free to share. You've got, I'm loving seeing all these different professions: medic, dentistry, public policy, aspiring solicitors, living the barrister life, academia, psychology. Yeah, I mean, welcome to you all. So grateful to have you. I hope you found it beneficial. And again, if you're interested for the event on the 2nd, feel free to join, but share it with others who might not be. Again, what we're trying to do is create a space for aspiring lawyers, but also talk about topics that are important for people beyond kind of just the lawyering space. So again, thank you. Follow us on Twitter, IG, LinkedIn, and I hope you'll keep in touch. And thank you all for supporting our cause. If you've joined us and didn't have the chance to register and make a donation, we'd be really grateful if you could support our fundraising campaign. And I think that's all. So thanks so much. Have a fantastic evening, and hopefully see you all again very soon.